This is an open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. I'm Joshua Levy, Committee Chair. It's Wednesday, March 23rd, 2022, and the meeting is being conducted in a hybrid manner consistent with current state regulations and is being recorded. Public access to this meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless the law requires it. This meeting will not have public comment except in connection with the first item of business, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. First, I'll confirm that a quorum of the members of the Finance Committee are present. When I state your name, please acknowledge your presence. Tom?
Here.
Rick?
Here.
Dick?
Here.
Jim?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
The chair is here. I don't believe anyone is attending remotely. Is that correct?
I do not see anyone.
Perfect. And Louise Misgard is also here. As a reminder, anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. First on the agenda is citizen request to address the Finance Committee. If there's anyone here in the room or online, please raise your hands. You can also press *9 if you're an attendee on the phone. I see no one in the room.
I don't see anyone there.
Okay. So then we'll move on to the second item, approval of the minutes of the prior meeting, March 9th, 2022. I think the most recent draft was version C. Were there any comments or did anyone need any more time to review them?
So moved. I move second. All right. Good start.
Okay. For the discussion, we'll take a vote. Tom?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. So now we come to the Community Preservation Committee consultation. Welcome. You can choose any seat you prefer.
All right.
This is perfect. Just as background, I'll give it some preliminary. So this is the CPC consultation with the Finance Committee, consistent with section 2.7.3.2.2 of the Needham General Bylaws. The statutory purpose of the consultation is to provide an opportunity for the Finance Committee to provide input to the CPC before it makes its recommendations to town meeting. I believe it's next week. The Finance Committee will make its own recommendations to town meeting at its April 6th meeting. In deference to the process and after speaking with the chair of the CPC, I'd like to make sure that tonight's conversation is framed as a dialogue between the CPC and the Finance Committee. And so if there are any questions of the applicants to the CPC or other boards, then those questions can be posted later date before the Finance Committee makes its own recommendations. This is just between the CPC and the Finance Committee for now.
Yes, that's what I understand.
Okay.
I, in terms of a dialogue, you better be careful for what it is for.
Okay.
I thought that I was coming here and getting spoken to, but that's fine.
So we'll
Feel free to
hear,
speak to Peter.
we'll hear just a general introduction from each article, and then the sense of the CPC, and then the Finance Committee can give its input as well.
Okay, so good evening. I'm Peter Pingator, Chair of the CPC. This is my third public presentation in as many weeks, starting with consultation with the Select Board, and we had our public hearing last week. Either I'm going to be really good or really boring, so we'll see. So I'm going to skip. I usually do an introduction about what the CPC does and how we fund and what our projects are, but I'm going to skip that because the viewing, you all are aware of it, and the viewing public has heard me say it twice in the last 2 weeks, as I said. But procedurally, we're here, as you said, Josh, to consult with the Finance Committee as part of consulting with the Select Board and seeking public input before we vote on our recommendations concerning applications that are before us for funding for FY 2023 to town meeting. And ultimately, of course, town meeting votes on whether to approve or reject our recommendations. Okay. There are, I believe, a total of 8 applications for funding as well as 2 finance articles to discuss, and you should have received a copy of a memo that I had forwarded to the Select Board, and then I copied you folks. This was details, the description of each of the applications, not the finance articles, but the applications before us. And then some detail regarding a sense of the committee. And as I always say, it's not a vote, but I want to give some guidance to the stakeholders before we vote, which usually comes, pretty, it's going to happen on the 30th, but that's a pretty short time before town meeting.
Peter, just a general question. Are the applications available online? Or if I wanted to go read each of the applications, where would I go to that?
So the applications are all online. You should start with the Community Preservation Committee drop down, under committees. Then you can look for applications for this year for FY 2023. And then under public hearing, I think, is where you'll find a full, complete packet, in total of about 600 pages of information, which is a compendium of the due diligence that we conducted with respect to the 8 separate applications that were on our docket. So it's all, and I'm glad you asked that so that everyone knows that we, the website is a little difficult at times to navigate, but that's where you can find it. We're doing our best to get that information up, and we had it up there prior to the public hearing.
Is it something that's still downloadable if I wanted?
Yeah, you can download it. It's a file that's you can definitely download that PDF onto your drive. And as I said, it's 600 pages, but it's actually well indexed, and you'll get, I think that there's a little cheat sheet which tells you which pages are tied to which particular articles too. Okay.
Does it say which ones we're supposed to vote for?
And no, it doesn't.
All right. Sorry. I'll let you have your presentation.
Okay, all right, so now we'll start with the articles, right?
Sure.
Article 15 appropriates community preservation fund. So that is our standard finance article. And I think what the question that you would want to discuss is as drafted, I think that it shows that there's an appropriation of anticipated revenues for FY 2020, including our property surcharge. And I believe we estimate the state match, which is based on our prior years, 20% of our prior year's property tax surcharge. Is that correct, Dave? Okay. So we estimate our state match at about 20%. And that's important because what we then do is allocate to each of the required reserve funds, community housing, historic resources, and open space. 2 things are notable. One is a community housing reserve reflects an estimated 11% contribution. So what you should anticipate, or what is, and I confess, I told Josh that we didn't have an explicit discussion about this at our sense of the committee meeting, but I would anticipate that we're going to request request that the appropriation be 22% of the estimated revenue to be contributed to the community housing reserve, so that the community housing reserve fund contribution would be approximately $808,000 or $809,400, as opposed to $404,700, which reflects in the draft, which is reflected in the draft warrant. So that's subject to our vote. But as I said, we didn't have an explicit discussion about the sense of the committee on that, but we've been reviewing financial summaries and projections where we've slotted in an estimated 22%.
Will that decrease any of these other items, or is that you just anticipating there's more money available?
No, it's going to certainly decrease because it's going to come out of the general reserve. So, but I still, let's see, I'm flipping back and forth between a couple of things.
You don't have the general reserve in front of you.
Oh, that's right. There's no general reserve fund. Okay, sorry. So I think that it's going to come out of the general reserve. Is that correct, Dave?
Yes,
Sorry.
you would reduce the amount that you would appropriate to the general reserve because it's a zero-sum game.
I've been doing this for a few years, but I still need my lifeline with Dave.
We all do.
And
Well, here, you're not alone. You're not
especially
alone.
with Rich.
You're not
Okay, all right. Okay, so now the question, so
Do you or Dave know what the balance of the general reserve is now, or what you had anticipated?
The general reserves live for 1 year, so it will be the general reserve for FY 23, and right now it doesn't exist because I don't have to tell the appropriation, and you'll be looking at general reserve, there'll be around $1,300, 1,300,000. The exact numbers will appear in the next version of the warrant that you will receive prior to your taking action on the article.
And is that assuming the increase of 22% of the community housing?
That's assuming that the committee votes to recommend 22%.
Okay, thank you.
And will you show at that time, David, what the present amounts are for in each of these reserves?
Yes, I will have that information as well.
Because right now, before appropriations, there's approximately $3.2 million in the community housing reserve. Because we're having a discussion about that.
About that one?
Okay. So, and the reason that we look to fund at that level has to do with applications that have come in from the Needham Housing Authority this year and projections on what they're going to be requesting in the next, let's call it 10 years. Because I think that's what it looks like. Getting ahead of myself just a little bit, but Linden Chambers looks like it's viable as a redevelopment project, but over a 4-phase funding period, which could extend out 10 years. And the same with respect to High Rock Homes, 1 and 2, that's going to be pushed out. But we're looking at a timeline from the Needham Housing Authority going out 12 years, which is actually pretty good for us because all of this is going to be funded out of cash and not debt. So, and I'll get to this, but it looks like if we're funding it at these kinds of levels, 20% per year, then at times, depending on a particular request, when the number gets real, we may have to dip into general reserves to fund a request. So it may exceed, basically, we may exceed funding community housing at 20% a year for the next 10 years at times. But it looks, based on what we've seen, it looks like it looks about like that. Okay.
So if I understand what you're saying, the 22% you're anticipating that request going up for another dozen years.
I think, yes.
Okay.
I think that makes what we've seen, I mean,
No, it's fine. I just want to make sure I understand.
that's.
I have no quarrels with it.
And all of that, that's it. And the other part of that, we've seen the substantial, there's substantial public support for it and select board support for funding community housing. And so the sense of the committee is, I assume the committee is going to vote in favor of that. I mean, we've been working with those models throughout our work this whole funding cycle. Okay. You want to have questions on?
Yeah, if that's presentation, I guess I'll open up the questions on this. Okay, we can go on to the next 16.
All right, so the next one, it reflects an adjustment in our reserve fund accounts based on revenue received that exceeded what our estimates are. So as you know, we're conservative in terms of funding our estimates in terms of what revenue is going to come in. We try and bump it up. We hedge on that by increasing our reserve fund contributions 1 point over the required amount of 10%. This year, we had a substantial increase in our state match. And so we have to then, we're going to have to take money out of general reserve and reallocate it to our community housing and other reserve fund accounts. The question that I would think you would have would be, okay, are you going to are you going to meet the 10% or are you going to fund the 20, or what are you going to do in terms of community housing? And I think that we would follow suit, especially in light of the fact that this deals with FY 2022 money, where the committee last year appropriated 22%, that we would appropriate or vote to appropriate an amount equaling, I think it's going to be 20%, because that's the goal really, is to just double the amount. And this is one of those unique circumstances where the money's already here, so we can do the mathematical calculation and fund the reserve accounts pursuant to the statutory requirements.
Well, you only have 2
Yeah, you do.
reserve
Yeah,
accounts.
you don't have housing.
You don't have.
Mr. Chair, this is yet
That's
another
for
article
housing.
that we discussed, that if the committee votes to do that, we'll make sure the wording is adjusted so that it reflects that there's monies being transferred from the general reserve to 3 of the required reserves. This was written to meet the 10% requirement And because the community housing reserve was budgeted at 22%, there was an assumption that no additional money, there is no legal requirement to put additional money into it. This article as it's written right now is to meet the legal requirement. But the town is certainly free to increase the amount it wants to put into any of the reserves at any time.
Do they need any appropriation to do that?
Yeah, they'll do that. So this article will be changed.
Amended.
No, it'll be changed because it's not going to be done on town meeting floor. It'll be done before the warrant is published.
Oh,
So, all right, I'm sorry for the confusion and we're already above 10%. We're probably, whatever, we're at 18%. So we would have to fund in there or whatever it is, 2% or 1%, some number like that. I think it
That's about on the
So I do have a question about this. So this one is called the general reserve, which is different from the annual reserve, right?
But we
general-
use them interchangeably. The
Okay,
general reserve is how it's referred to on the recap.
okay. What is it called? What is the amount that's just sitting there in the bank right
In the general reserve, it's, I have to get back to you, I don't know,
Okay.
for this year, it's,
now? Not for this year, like that we have right now.
it's only a one, the general reserve is the reserve that is not committed to a dedicated purpose and it disappears and goes to free
To-
cash.
to
at
free
the end of-
cash,
at
okay.
the end of the year.
So how much do we have in free cash, I guess? is my question.
CPA free
Yeah,
cash, right?
Yeah.
CPA free cash is approximately 2.5 million. I
Yeah.
believe.
So you were asking the question earlier, what the balance is, that's really the answer.
Okay, so CPA free cash.
But it's not coming from CPA free cash. It's coming from
Right.
general reserve.
Okay, but so general reserve and annual reserve are the same thing.
So what effectively will happen is the general reserve will be reduced by town meeting as it increases the open space reserve,
Yep.
the historic resources reserve, and if the committee opts to increase the funding amount to the housing reserve, the amount into the housing reserve.
Thank you.
so I would just ask that when all these machinations are done, I think, at least I would like to know, at the end of the day, if it's all approved by town meeting, what are the total amounts that are going to be in each bucket? Because it sounds to me like you're advocating for 22% increase to housing in the Article 15. Now you're going to put more money into housing in Article 16. So I'd just like to know, and I was just told that the current balance is 3.2 million. So I'd want to know, how does it all add up?
Yeah, Peter, if I could.
Sure.
Yeah. What we did over the course of the year is, as we analyzed each one of these articles, we took a look at the longer term impact over the next 5 years, about what it would look like, what the impact would be on the reserves. If the reserves went negative, which in some instances it did over the 5 years, so it caused us to re-examine and reevaluate, shuffle priorities of the longer term projects as we go out through time. And then we recently met a couple times with Dave just to verify the spreadsheet and the calculations. And that all comes out of Dave's memo when he puts it all together and provides us with a final version of what that spreadsheet will look like. And yeah, I think you said, Dave, the end of this week, maybe?
Yes, you'll have it before your meeting on the 30th.
So all of the information, all the questions you're asking, all we have are approximations right now, but when Dave does it, obviously, he does it a lot more definitively than we
Right,
do.
so we'll have the balances.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so he usually issues his financial summary memo, and which lists what our projected expenditures are. And it will include the balances in each of the reserve fund accounts as well as the general reserve for FY 2023, right? So, but we're gonna get that, we'll get that soon, right? Well, I think we end up getting it, we always get it before we vote.
Yes.
And so that document will be available.
Great, thank you.
A general question about like appropriation policy. So when you have money in free cash and in the reserves, how do you decide which one to draw upon first?
I don't know that we make a huge distinction between the two.
Yeah, as we take a look at it, if we try and use free cash first, sometimes you don't have to. You can allocate it between free cash, general reserve. So when we get into a project, we'll get into a later discussion on one of the items. We're gonna use $3 million in cash, of which 2.25 will be coming out of free cash. 750 will come out of the general reserve. At the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter because it all rolls back into free cash for the next year anyways.
Just a follow-up question. During the course of the year, however, if there, can you move dollars from one account to another? Or are you locked in?
Once you put money in the housing reserve, for example, you can't move it out of the housing reserve unless it's for an authorization for a project.
But if you needed to, you could fund, if you were short on that, you could fund out of free cash.
Yes, or
So
general
my
reserve.
question is, since free cash is the most flexible tool you've got, why draw that down first as opposed to last?
Well, we only have one funding. Well, we essentially only have one funding cycle. If there's an emergency, we'll bring a warrant article to our October town meeting. But if that's the
Yeah, I
advice that
think-
you're providing.
Yeah, I think, for example, let's use the boat launch just as an example. That's not gonna be there, but anyways.
You shouldn't have talked,
Of all the projects to talk about, that's probably
I'm just using.
I know an example.
Why don't we take the?
He wasn't here the first time. He already was.
It's fine. I just,
You're on a
I was
roll.
just using that as an example. That would probably come out of open space
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
free cash or the general reserve, as an example.
That's my question. So why wouldn't you set it up that way and keep you as flexible as you can with free cash?
We usually do, except,
Almost all of these are from free cash. One is not. All the others seem to be from free cash.
I didn't look at I didn't.
Yeah,
look at
so
this
that
out.
was my question.
Yeah, that's fine. I didn't realize that. When we do it, you'll see how it gets allocated.
Okay, but can we also say we'll take that, that's a comment that we will certainly take under consideration? That's absolutely.
No, fine.
No, absolutely.
You'll see that in Dave's memo where it comes from, all right?
So I have actually a question for Dave, and it's been it's only a 2-year trend, but twice, the last 2 years, we've been under, the allocation has been greater from the state. You anticipate that somehow we should use 12% instead of 11, or?
Well, generally I use 10% as an estimate, and I bumped it up to 20% based on what's happened the last couple of years. In both instances, the funds came near the tail end of the fiscal year where there's a supplemental appropriation made by the legislature for the purpose of additional funds, which was unforeseen. The only guidance I truly rely upon is not the coalition that most people look at, because they're a lobbying organization. They're not a branch of the government. The Department of Revenue is the guidance. The Department of Revenue thinks it would be foolhardy for any community to appropriate with the expectation of more than 20%. So that's the basis of my
And
20%.
I don't think there's any problem with what you're doing in 16. That actually makes good sense, if you ask me. You don't want to overestimate, and you have the opportunity and the ability to correct it. So that to me seems like a,
There's no
proper
problem
tool.
with the way it's been done. It's just that the twice in 2 years, and we hadn't, I don't know when it happened previously, that we were, our
It's happened before.
reserves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's,
Actually,
but Tommy, I'm not sure that's bad.
No, I'm not suggesting it's
Yeah.
bad. I'm just curious
Yeah.
as to what Dave's thinking was.
Please, let's do. Okay, Article 17. Appropriate for the NHA Assistant Executive Director position. And this is a request for a total of $97,500 to be spent over a 2-year period to fund 50% of the Assistant Executive Director position at NHA.
Peter, I gotta tell you, I don't understand this one. at all.
Jim, can we,
Yeah,
let's just continue for the.
oh, okay. I read it, but go ahead.
Okay, so the basis for the request is that they're in the midst of this modernization and redevelopment initiative. And that there's not enough bandwidth on their administrative staff to properly staff the redevelopment initiative. And that's the basis for the request. The sense of the committee is strong support for the request. I would say the same feedback I'm getting from both the public and the boards of selectmen. And I think as a generalized, this is a kind of a moment in time to try and revamp, revitalize and redevelop those properties. And that to the degree that this would assist that, then people are supportive of it. And I'm prepared to talk about I'll head off one source of request with one source of concern, which is that in terms of the kind of questions of eligibility, we've been in touch with our council regarding it. And we think, I think that it can be addressed through grant requests, through the grant agreement. But
Can
from
we-
there, we'll take some comments.
Is this a new position?
I think that well, there was an assistant executive director at one time. And so my understanding is that there had not been an assistant executive director for a period of time. My further understanding is that they have hired in the recently, within the last 60 days, hired an assistant executive director. And with anticipating that some of her duties would involve the modernization and redevelopment work. So it's not new, but I believe it was not an active position for a period of time. I'm going to add one historical note that I know about, and I don't want to confuse the facts, but I know that for a period of time, the Needham Housing Authority managed the Wellesley Housing Authority. And it may have been that after Needham Housing Authority stopped managing Wellesley Housing Authority, they did not have the assistant executive director position. I could be wrong about that, but I do know that there was not such a position in the recent past, and it was only recently filled again.
One more question.
Sure.
The 97,500, is that commensurate with the town's new classification compensation system for an assistant director of something?
Okay, so that is only, by the way, that's a total cost, and that's only 50% of.
But that comes out of the
2
annual
years.
salary. Yeah.
Oh, 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
So 2 years. And the answer is, I don't know, although I'll note that the housing authority is not subject to those provisions, right? It's not a part of town government, but I'm gonna yield to Dave.
Go ahead.
Just for clarification, the Needham Housing Authority is a separate legal entity
Yeah.
from the town of Needham, and therefore the town's
So no
classification plan has nothing.
Gotcha, so no parity is ever maintained,
Yeah.
okay.
But it would be substantial, it would be pretty unfair for
Yeah.
the town to fund at a higher level than we're paying our own employees if we were to fund it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
does this include the cost of benefits as well? Or would that be carried by some other
It was
organization?
total loaded cost, benefits plus salary.
The benefits come out
So
of the
the
town?
benefits run what,
No.
37,000 a year?
I'm not an expert on that, Dave.
What's
I'm
the
sorry.
benefit cost, isn't it 30-ish?
30 range overall, the lower the compensation, the higher.
So
The
this
percentage
is
of
roughly
benefits.
60,000 a year position we're talking about?
We don't know that. Housing Authority is a separate entity from the
Right.
town. We don't know whether this is what their benefits
So
are.
they're
We don't know
not
anything.
benefited under the town program?
They're completely
Okay,
separate from the town.
Fine. I withdraw my question. Or assertion.
I think Jim had something to say.
Did I?
Yes.
No, I was told to keep quiet. So I did, but now I will chime in. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the CPA was never meant to fund personnel. Never. That's just not, anyone that's gonna tell me that's the case is making it up. Because we were there in 2002, 3, 4 when we were trying to get this thing passed. So I'm not against any warrant article that would fund personnel. And you can get me whatever. I've seen more town council opinions that I don't agree with, 1 iota. So it's not going to make a difference to me. Now, the rest of my colleagues may think this is great. What I would do is if you want to get someone to help run this great project, which I'm 100% in favor of, I would hire a contractor. Not someone who's an employee, not someone who now has built into it future expenditures down the road, and say to them, give them a 2-year contract, 3-year contract, whatever the case may be. That's how I would do it. And to me, if there was an appropriate request for that expense, you're not funding personnel, what you're doing is the same thing as hiring a design firm, hiring someone to do feasibility. It's the same idea. And John, since you do a lot of this in your private life,
So I
Does that
couldn't,
make
I
sense?
couldn't agree with you more. Both on the first statement about CPA not being in place, at least in my purview of it, for personnel, and two, for project purposes. The driver of commonly, and I'm just going to equate it to nonprofits, and I see it with what happens there is if they have a big project coming up, they will hire a consultant to work with them on putting together the various components of the project, whether it might be funding and new market credits might be one part of it. And the design, working together with the different sort of cooks who are needed in the kitchen to build this project. But you don't need it and do it by hiring an employee for the actual entity that is operating it. So that's how it, just as you're appropriating funds here for design and other types surveying, this would be a consultant expense that would be the equivalent of that. And that's how I would go forward if I was doing it. And I couldn't support this position. I'm in favor of the concept. I just don't think this is the right mechanism to do what they're seeking to do.
So,
why
don't we just can we take all the comments and then we'll respond?
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise,
Go
it'd be
go ahead,
comments.
Tom.
Jim may be surprised that I actually agree with him, but I do. I'm concerned, but I would like to ask a question. I don't know if you know the answer is, what is the long-term plan on this? Is it
So-
do we come back every 2 years to ask for this money,
Well,
which,
You know,
as you hear, may not be supported by this group, but
Right.
I just want to know what the plan
embedded
is.
within the request itself is a statement that the assistant director position would be funded went through the development through the development appropriations for once they're up in 2 years' time. So they're not going to be back. This is 2 years, and then by then they're going to have their full development funds in place, and they anticipate that that's how the position will be funded. That's the statement. You know, that's what we're getting in the application. So that, yeah, we don't anticipate them being back, and they're representing to the contrary.
So I think.
Josh,
Louise
can I
is-
just ask, clarify? If I could clarify something for Jim and for John. John.
I want to get the questions in first, and then, is that okay?
You're the chair.
Okay. Go ahead, Louise.
So I agree with everything that has been said so far. In addition, I also am concerned when we sit as a finance committee, we're actually reviewing positions for employees, whether or not we're going to be funding staff for the town. And I think I have the added problem of funding staff for an entity that is not part of the town. And I don't think that even if we are able to fund personnel through CPA, we should not be funding personnel in non-town entities.
Yeah, I just picking up on that statement you made, Peter, at the end. This is expected to be co-terminus with the construction period and the position of concept ends. That's how I'm reading this.
That's how I'm reading.
Okay.
That's how I'm.
I think those are the questions, Rick. Please go
Okay.
ahead.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to comment on John and Jim's point. The Housing Authority has in fact hired a consultant to do all of this massive project. They put it out for bid. They awarded the contract to the Cambridge Housing Authority. They have been working on this for quite a period of time now, preparing all the paperwork, working with the agency. So this position is one that would represent the agency and oversee the housing authorities, Cambridge Housing Authority's activities for the project. It's more of a inline supervisory position of the project manager. So just so that you're clear, this person is not going to be doing any of that design work, development work, anything like that.
That's not what I wasn't contemplating that. I'm contemplating that this would be a consultant who you would hire to represent you, the housing authority's interests in developing this project.
Yeah, that's fine. I just want to clarify, just in case there was some confusion.
Like a project management position.
Right, OPM, owner, kind of an owner's project manager.
Well, I remember, a couple of years ago, we had a situation before the CPC where there was a request to fund an assistant administrative assistant as such for the housing authority, I believe, when they were taking on some of the Wellesley issues going on, I believe. Now, and we had great discussion about it back then. We had less discussion about this situation because we had already kind of been through discussion of that.
Okay. Let me just clarify that, which is actually, we funded through CPA funds, the town's, affordable housing.
That was
director.
but it was someone working for the
Yeah,
town.
absolutely, no, so with someone, no, but your distinctions are well noted, so that's a town personnel, that's right. To your point, Jim, I know you don't want to hear this, but there are.
You can just hear us. It's just.
It won't have any effect.
Won't
Okay.
impact.
There's a community preservation alliance database, and it reflects that community housing coordinators and positions similar to that. Who are not necessarily town employees. They could be employees of a community development corporation or affordable housing trust. Or those positions are funded. And it's under the language of the statute, which is somewhat broadly interpreted at times. Under support of community housing.
This is the advocacy group you were talking about, right,
Yeah.
David?
Yes.
Yes.
But that's it, but that's a database. It's not like they're not making up the facts, right? It's a database.
No, they're making interpretations which people may or may not agree with.
So
And
any-
they're doing it
what I'm
based
just-
on the manner in which they want to advocate for a particular result.
I'm just, well, I gotta, I don't want to debate this too much, but it's a database that reports what the funding request is and what the money was used for. That's what it is. And but it doesn't, not making any representation.
So-
That's all.
But if I understand you correctly, you're saying that there's a database that shows that monies have been used for this in other communities for similar purposes.
The housing
And
trust funds are completely different from housing authorities.
But I would approach it in a different way, Jim, which is that those cases, I mean, those are just reported expenditures about, and they're not, but they're not like case law, they're not adjudicated. There's no enforcement agency, if you will, really, with respect to community housing, with respect to CPA.
Go ahead, Louise.
So in the description, what it says the position will do is support the day-to-day operations of the housing authority. That's what it says.
And we've looked at the, if you look at the job description, it includes that plus some support of the modernization and redevelopment initiative. And so the way that I would address that is, and we'll have to have discussions with the proponents about that, is through a grant agreement, because obviously we shouldn't be funding a part of a position that is for day-to-day operations of the housing authority. So I think that can be addressed through the grant agreement.
That's what it says.
Yeah, I don't mean to beat up on you.
Yeah.
But as I read this, it says the exact opposite of what you're telling us is going to happen. It says this position will do the day-to-day activities of the executive director, free the executive director up to manage the project.
Are we reading?
We're reading the warrant, the description of it in the
You're
warrant.
reading the description of the warrant.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So all right, that's.
Okay, unless there's anything else, I think you.
Repeat that, Horst.
Concerns.
You know that one?
I'm not saying that that's correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm basically telling you it's
Yeah.
incorrect. But I'm trying to give you the nuance of what it looks like.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think how we took this when we were at our meetings was that here's a critical time of the Needham Housing Authority to get projects done, and the work that's going to be involved to make sure the grant funding, grants are applied for correctly of what's going on. And we need to do whatever we can to make sure that's done in a timely manner so it occurs. And this position was a very short-lived funding position from us. We're not in favor of funding, personnel in either. We're seeing this as a very short-lived funding stance for a very critical period. That's how we took it for ourselves. I understand what you're saying, because I think all of us are basically in agreement. We're interpreting this slightly differently because of what's going on in the time frame, what's going on. That's all. That's how we arrived at this.
So it sounds like you interpret it to be project-based rather than.
That's how that's basically time-sensitive, project-based. I think that's how I interpret it, basically.
I think that's different than some of our understanding.
I understand that. That we all have our own interpretation. That's how, basically how I was interpreting.
Well, we're gonna clarify this.
Fine, okay.
Wouldn't it seem that you would just fold it in, if that's what the position is for, that you would fold it into the appropriation, which is Article 18, which is about your sort of pre-development costs for the project. And this would be a component of those pre-development costs. I think you would eliminate a lot of the things you're gonna hear from us, that you've heard from us, and you're gonna hear from us again on it. There's my suggestion, is that if there's a need there, the way you guys have articulated, that's how I would go about doing it. That's what I'd recommend you do. Fold it into that Article 18.
What we do for every other project we have.
Yeah, understood.
You want to move on to Article 18?
Sure. Article 18. These are pre-development design costs for lending changes. And so this is actually, the housing authority is engaging an engineering firm to do the actual drawings and do pre-development work. Basically, get this closer to being, for lack of a better term, shovel ready. I think that if you looked at my memo, we understood that what they're really listing is that over a period of time, basically all of those one-story buildings will probably be torn down. There'll be buildings redeveloped around it. There may be some gut renovation in addition to some of the 2 or 3-story buildings. That's a possibility. But basically the entire site in the end is going to be redeveloped over a 4-phase period. So these are the design and engineering drawings for the entire 4-phase project. We had, since the committee we had some question about practical funding all of this, given that it was a multi-phase and we had assurance, we felt confident about or received representations concerning funding of the first phase. But in the end, I think the sense is that we need to get the drawings on the page in order to get this project going. There was strong support for it by the select board and strong community support as well. I think what I'll just note at some point when you have this, we'll bring it up, but this 2 things that I want to note is that this grant, along with a grant monies totaling $2.7 million that were from the state, 1.25 million of ARPA funds and 1.5 million of partnership for growth allocation, that the housing authority anticipates that those combined 3 sources of funds would complete. I'm looking at the FAQ that we had the advocates or the proponents put together. Would complete pre-development tasks for Linden Street and Chambers Street properties. So it's not necessarily leverage. The money's already there. That money will be used for a different purpose. But I think in fairness to the proponent, you should note that there's other pre-development money that's been granted and that's sitting there, and that this will be used in conjunction with.
Mr. Chairman, so first off, I will say for the 5th time, I'm in favor of the redevelopment of this area. I think it's as important a project as the town has done maybe in 30 or 40 years. However, do we have the requisite expertise to run the project? I just don't know who is, who out there is going to be able to rally feasibility, engineering, architecture, grants and other monies from state and federal sources. And again, I kind of look to John because he does this for a living. But do we have someone who is, if not nationally, at least a very strong, locally known expert in this field who can run this project and turn it into something great? I have nothing against the town of Needham, nothing against the Needham Housing Authority. But in all honesty, when we, build the high school and Emory Grover and all these, we bring in well-known construction firms to run it. We have a project manager from our construction division that is there and helps and makes things, run on time. But they're not building it, they're not designing it, they're not, so who's the point person? Number one, who's the outside source that's gonna run everything? And then two, who's the point person from within, quote unquote, the town, whoever the town is, housing authority or the town, who's gonna be the conduit? And before I let you answer, John, am I saying this right?
Yeah, so I think what you're speaking about is, and I use the acronym OPM, Owner's Project Manager. And they're kind of like gypsies. They go from project to project. They'll finish. I did a lot with the OPM for Win on the Encore. He lived that project for 6 years, and now he's gone to somewhere else because it's up and running. So there are people who you hire who come in to be, our sort of master who puts it all together, the different components, which is the design component, all those types of things, and that he or she has it all together and drives the bus on that. And there's no one, I don't know the housing authority particularly, but I wouldn't think there's someone there presently on staff who has those capabilities.
Yeah,
Let me try and answer that. That's what the Cambridge Housing Authority has been hired to do. They've done numerous number of these projects, not only in Framingham, where they spend inordinate amount of money on affordable housing through their housing authority, but they have a staff of over 20 people, including project management, to oversee this particular project. They've appointed a project manager to the Needham projects already, and that's the person that's doing it. They went out for bid, and they proceeded to bid and hire the Cambridge Housing Authority as their OPM for the project.
And who ran the bid, Rick?
Someone in the housing authority did. I don't know. I wasn't there.
No, I'm just
I don't
curious.
know.
so there's,
Somebody in the Needham Housing Authority.
Let me just,
did the
so
bid.
you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do.
So if the town of Needham did it,
Yep,
it would be someone in construction and facilities.
I understand.
Does the Needham Housing Authority have someone in construction and facilities who can run a bid process for what could be a 12, 15, $20 million project?
Oh, I fully understand what you're asking, Jim, and I don't have an answer for that. Okay. The other thing I just want to point out, just let me digress for 1 second, because I noticed why you're asking your question about open space. I've noticed throughout these articles that are coming up, there's a lot of mistakes, for lack of a better term, in some of the numbers. They need to be changed, like you have up above, appropriate 1.2 million, and then down in the description, it's changed to 1.386 million. The other thing is that it's
number's
coming
right?
from open space where it's not, it's coming out of the housing reserve bucket. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be clarified, even on the next article. We're not looking for $62,500. They're looking for a lot more than that, for 123,000 is written in the article information. The article itself is not written according to at least my knowledge of what the article is about.
So I would encourage you to sort that out with the town manager's office.
Yeah, I did.
I'm gonna, like, I kind of said this to you in a private email to you, which I think is on lessons learned. Problem with volunteer work is you can't figure it out. It takes about 3 years to figure out how to do the job right. Maybe a long.
Then you're gonna leave.
Well,
Right.
yeah, then you.
And the sooner the better.
So,
Oh, that's a zinger.
I think we need to leave the
Not him,
memos
see.
for the next person, is what we need to do. But I need to get my hands on the draft warrant as soon as it's out. Right?
As long as we have the final version for town meeting in front of us by April 6th when we vote.
Well, we did it by next
We need
week.
it
You
by
need
the
it
30th.
sooner. I know. I understand.
Question, which is the more accurate? The article information or the language?
Actually, right now, the article information is, except for the fact that the.
Except for the one wrong above.
It's, yeah.
Not always.
yeah, and it's not necessarily, the 1.386 million is the right number.
Okay, so
No, it isn't the right number.
Yes, it is.
Is it? That's the right number? Okay, but that's gonna come out of the,
That'll come out of housing, the community housing.
yeah.
All
right, so now-
it's already.
Mr. Chip, so maybe none of us here were around during this, but Jim, maybe you perhaps might be one of the.
I'm
most
sure he was. I'll tell you a whole story
Not
about
on the finance committee though, but I mean,
I don't want
when
to
the
be
High
sorry.
Rock project,
Yeah, it was-
project was going on, was being redeveloped. How did that occur? Who was, that was a Needham Housing Authority, I believe.
No, that was the school
No,
department.
that wasn't.
No, I'm not talking about the school. I'm talking about rebuilding. one of
Oh,
those- the rebuilding.
the two-family home.
Yeah,
That was
reselling the
Rich Gatto did it through, it was through the housing authority.
Yeah, but
We,
Go ahead.
can I talk?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
So we had consultants. We had a finance consultant. And we also we hired an independent consultant who actually happens to be Margaret Moran, who was now an employee of Cambridge Housing Authority, and was in their redevelopment office. So she's familiar with the town. So I don't think that, in the usual practice, by the way, in housing authorities is that the housing authority executive director is the chief procurement officer. So that they're usually qualified to write a.
So I just read the RFP. It's not for construction services. I just looked it up. No, the RFP that the Cambridge Housing Authority responded to. It's to help with grants, it's to help with the finances, it's to help with administration, to help them figure out what they need to do, but it's not construction supervision.
Okay. And from what you said, Jim, I mean, this is the done deal, Jim? Yeah. Rick, over there. Is this a done deal? I know we looked a lot. Yeah, exactly.
So I want to make sure I have
I'm
a
sorry.
question.
Okay, my question is this a done deal in terms of the Cambridge Housing Authority has been signed and on it, and our only thing is, do we fund it or not? Or that's the impression I got from what you said.
Yeah, the Cambridge Housing Authority is a done deal.
Mhm.
It's been part of the bid, they're part of the process. The whole thing. The 1.386 million is not for the Cambridge Housing Authority. The 1.386 million is to actually do the work associated with determining what needs to be done on site.
So
what
they're going to
repairs-
engage architectural and engineering firms to put together designs, specs, and as redevelopment conditions and drawings.
So when I go on to the question I had before about finding out more information about this, will there be a place that will break out of the 1.386 million, what is going to what? In other words, whether there's a pro forma or a budget or whatever of that 1.386 says that 100,000 is going to a civil engineer, 200,000 is going to an architect. Will I find that there, Peter?
I don't think that you will.
Well,
But
I can't support this. I need that has to be presented, at least to me, for me to be able to support it.
I understood. Rick, do you happen to know if there is a pro forma?
I'm trying to think
Breaks
if
down?
they showed us one, and
I
I'm
think
not
that-
sure it's on the website.
So
So
let's put that under additional
We'll
question,
get you there.
and then because that's a fair question and that makes sense. Okay.
I know, I've seen the breakdown of the 1.386 million, John. I just don't know it's in the type of specific detail that you want. And have to go back.
And I think that.
And I'd love to know how they got it. In other
Well, I
words,
think
it
they
gets
came-
that same question, which
Yeah, but I
is,
think that that's what. one of
is there the
things that came-
requisite expertise? We want the project to be done.
Yeah.
But we want to support it with financial resources, knowing that it's being spent in the right area. And I will just say, because I can't stop to breathe. If I do, I won't be able to talk again. That in the old days, we'd hire someone to do a feasibility study. PVBC would do it. Then you go out and you get design money. Then you come back to town meeting and you get the final construction. And that all made sense to me. And I'm not saying that isn't going to be done here, Rick and Artie and Peter. I'm not saying that. But I guess I personally would just like some assurance that we're doing this kind of in a regular and usual course.
Peter, Reg Foster looked like at one point he had his hand up or trying to talk, but I don't know if since he's part of the CPC, is that, do we want?
So it does sound like there are more questions for other agencies like the Needham Housing Authority. So since that's outside of this consultation, we can probably take that offline and get that information later date.
I would encourage you to do that
Yeah.
too. And I do think that there's a breakdown, and I do think that my understanding is that Cambridge Housing Authority, their consultant, was instrumental in coming up with the proposed 1.386. So there's got to be a pro forma. it may even be in those 600 pages, just to be honest with you. I have not turned every page. But just in the, I have not turned every page. Just-
I think it would be helpful, and I'll stop after this, is, it seems to, like, some of this is sort of fragmented into either it's different things here, or maybe different things to come in the future, various funding requests. I wonder if there's sort of just an overall picture of what it is that the project would constitute, over timeframes, and sort of ultimately what would be done. And so that we can, in a sense, have the globe, knowing there's all kinds of details within the globe, but just having that overall picture of what it is that's looking to be accomplished.
Right. So,
And I think that would,
And that's, David, what I had asked at the end of the meeting last week or 2 weeks ago. Remember, I said, I'm supposed to present on this. And if I'm gonna present on it, I need to know the whole enchilada.
they have the whole enchilada. There is a complete redevelopment plan. It's online. And so, and it's available. It was done in 2019, I believe. And they're pivoting from that. The housing authority is pivoting from that. So I'm surprised. So we'll make sure that you have that information. Part of the difficulty.
pivoting in that they're pivoting to implement it, or they're pivoting to do something different.
No, sorry. That's the basis for all of these.
Yeah, so that's why they're starting to implement it.
Implement it.
And then we're seeing some of the steps of the implementation.
Right.
And maybe in so doing, at least for someone like, I just need to go back, I just need to see that global thing.
Yeah, if you take a look at and we have that, if you take a look at the article information and the description, it talks about, in general terms, what the 1.386 million is going to be used for. One of the key aspects of this project is they're going to need to get zoning relief for the changes that they want to do. So you've got to make a lot of investigative information. They've got to develop plans and work with the planning department to come up with the appropriate way to handle the zoning. So part of this is that, and it describes in there pretty in somewhat overview terms, zoning relief, geotechnical borings, traffic studies. There's a lot of money. So this isn't really the design money, as you're calling for it. And that's where the Cambridge Housing Authority comes into play, is to do this.
So,
And we do have a breakdown of the other money that they're going to be looking for. So
Go ahead, Pete. Let Peter finish. I'm sorry.
I think that it is worth your while and to have a consult with the housing authority. I know that Reg Foster is the chair of the housing authority, has had consultations with just about every board in town. And so I think that it makes sense for you folks to have a consultation with him as well. I don't want to be in that, I just think in terms of clarification and getting you the right information. Some of the information that you've asked for, I know is readily available, and, we'll follow up. We can do a follow-up and get you that information right after the meeting. But I do think it's worth your while to actually have a discussion with the proponents. And the odd thing about this request is when they come in, and this is what Jim is really pointing to, is this is a non-town entity that's making this application. And so it's always a little bit of a challenge. And I think that we're learning on our side what the challenges are. But this is, as you point out, this is a significant amount of money and a significant project. Let's have some of the assurances in front of us that we usually have when we fund town projects, right?
Yeah.
That's a fair request. Okay. And so let's see if we can satisfy that, because the process is entitled to that. Right.
And we'll definitely be asking you questions on April 6th. We'll have them in as well to discuss when we.
So is that prior to your vote?
Our vote is the evening of April 6th, and we'll get the information before then.
Okay, good. Okay.
So, go ahead.
Just wanted to clarify that we did not fund construction back in 2006 and 7.
I'm sorry?
We did not fund construction back in 2006 and 7, because that was like a multi-million-dollar project. So I think maybe go back to that roadmap and see what we did there might be helpful to the CBC.
I didn't I'm sorry, I was distracted by some other information, but if you look at the 600-page packet on page 34, you'll see the breakdown of the use of funds between William Chambers. It'll be a breakdown of the William Chambers schematic design. And it's a line item, okay? And that also has the breakdown of other applications, including the assistant director position. So
Could you send that to us? Thanks. I'm not gonna look at 600 pages.
No, I gave you the page reference.
34.
Page 34. yes.
Already copy it, send it. How's
We
that?
will
Not
send,
hard.
we will send that.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, appreciate it.
All right, so, Louise said something and I didn't hear, it, so I apologize.
So I think, just to clarify, we did not pay for construction of the work that was done back in 2006 and 2007. So this is slightly different from what we did before, and then back then, there was a lot of information about where the funding was going to come from for the entire project. So the town knew the viability of the project at the time we funded part of it.
If I could just comment on that. In this particular instance, they haven't identified all of the funding sources yet. Because a lot of that will be part of this analysis is determined once they know what they need, where they can go and get it. So.
Are there any other questions about Article 18?
Okay, Article 19. This is appropriate for property. This is client surveys. Well, too short a summary, but it's a property existing sort of conditions report. And what it essentially is that it's money totaling about $250,000 that will be used to survey the HUD financed developments for Needham Housing Authority. And it's a basically prerequisite to determine what the property conditions are, which will affect the funding formula for the kind of financial re-engineering that they're going to be going through which will in the end unlock the numbers that I've seen of $20 to $40 million over the next X number of years by changing this from basically a Section 9 HUD finance to a Section 8 finance project. But as a condition proceeding, they need to do this survey, and from there they can move to change the funding source and the funding formula for these projects, which is going to unleash which will unlock funding that they'll use to rehab, redevelop the housing authority projects at Seabed's Way, Captain Robert Cook Drive, and High Rock Homes. That's also a HUD.
Who is going to be doing this survey?
The survey I will be done by the Cambridge Housing Authority.
And that is within their bailiwick. That's what they do.
I think that it's, I don't know, but I assume so. I mean, they just to give you some sense, they over the course of the last 10 years or so, they've done a significant amount of redevelopment and modernization within.
Do we have the authority to, does town meeting have the authority to vote an appropriation to the Cambridge Housing Authority as opposed to the Needham Housing Authority?
This is an appropriation to the Needham Housing Authority.
I read that. My question is, does town meeting have the authority to make an appropriation under the CPA to the Cambridge Housing Authority? The point I'm trying to make is, instead of going through a middle person, if we have identified a company who is an expert in this type of survey that needs to be done, wouldn't we be better off just making the CPA appropriation directly to them rather than having some other entity who then has to manage and oversee the other entity? And I don't know the answer to the question.
Well, can I address that conceptually? It really depends on what your definition of we is, right? Because in this circumstance, the town does not control the Needham Housing Authority.
Right.
It's not your department.
Right.
So this is a separate entity saying we need funding.
Right, but the Cambridge Housing Authority had made a similar request. could the town meeting have a warrant article that said to raise and transfer the appropriate sum of $123,652 to,
Jim, let's assume it's not.
Who's going to watch the
call it
Cambridge Housing
Housing
Authority?
Pardon me?
Who's going to watch the Cambridge Housing Authority?
well,
let's
my
not-
point is, if they're the resident expert, and Rick, I'm happy to have you chime in, but what I'm trying to do is make sure that whoever is the entity that knows how to run these projects is running the projects. That's my only concern. And by the way, for those of you in the Needham Housing Authority, I'm not suggesting you can't do it. I just don't know if you can do it. I know that I'm on the finance committee. I couldn't run any project. So I just want to make sure that when we're allocating these monies and appropriating these monies.
But isn't this what you're asking? Aren't you asking that they hire contractors?
Yeah. No,
Okay,
but
so this
that's
is.
that's-
this is
no,
the
but
housing
do it
authority hiring a
directly.
contractor.
They're the ones hiring it.
But now, but
It's their property.
so I don't understand. Now, one concern, I mean, remember that they have to do drawdowns. They have to sign, they have to sign a rep and warranty and a warrant to the town concerning the funds in order to be reimbursed for them. So you have accountability over that non-government entity through a grant agreement and through a financial drawdown warrant that is signed by an officer of the non-governmental entity. But I don't know if that's enough of an insurance.
Yeah,
I was just gonna suggest, just take away the idea that it's the Cambridge Housing, it's XYZ Corporation. Okay, so we're not funding the Cambridge Housing Authority, we're funding a consultant that they went through a bid process to hire.
Mhm.
And that doesn't necessarily, it could have been XYZ Corporation versus Cambridge Housing Authority.
Okay, let's go down the line, Louise. go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions. One is, what is the amount that is being requested? You said an amount, there's a different amount written in the article, there's a third amount written in the description.
It's $123,632.
I know you said according, but that's okay.
So 2
Then
years?
my second,
No, wait, well, hold on.
you said a quarter million.
I did, because that was the total contract amount, because the other Needham Housing Authority is paying for the other half, 120. So they're asking for 50% of the cost of doing the survey. So the total cost, I did some quick math, would be $250,000.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, the article
Nobody else
information-
can-
article
With
information
clear
should
permission
include
from-
that.
Anyway.
I'm just a little.
No, it's great that you do that, but the article
TH
information doesn't
30
say
is
that.
per week.
So my second question is, the housing authority is asking for additional staffing because they're going to start this Linden Chambers project. How can they now start yet this other project with the amount of staffing? that they have? And I understand this is just a survey, but how are they going to manage
So
all of
this-
this?
This project is, from my reading, this project is within, this is within the wheelhouse of the Cambridge Housing Authority. So they can do this, so the plan is, here, think about this. The plan is to take these developments, survey them.
Mhm.
They go through an elaborate formulation, they figure out what the HUD subsidies would be over X period of time. All of those calculations, all of those applications, putting it in the queue, that's going to be handled by the Cambridge Housing Authority because they've done it before. In fact, the part of the packet will reflect an analysis by the Cambridge Housing Authority about the 3 or 4 different ways of unlocking the equity that these properties have as they exist now, and based on the supplements that they receive over the next 20 years, and based on the supplements that the tenants receive over the next 20 years. This is particularly focused on on the skill set that the Cambridge Housing Authority has.
Louise, do you have other questions?
No.
Okay, Tom, go ahead.
Does that, if there's any, well, I hope that answers the question, but if it does not, you'll have your further consultation with the applicant.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't have a question until you just spoke for a minute, so you may regret that. So
Again,
if I understand correctly, I may be out of my bailiwick here. What's going on over at Robert Cook Drive and in that area, that's a federal housing. where Linden and Chambers is not.
Yes, you want me to, so that's, yes.
I don't want to get, no.
No, that's important to know.
Don't get me wrong.
That's actually very important to know.
Okay, so are you saying the Cambridge Housing Authority is going to be running both these projects? That's kind of what I thought I heard. I just want to make sure I understand. I don't have anything, I don't have a problem with it. I just want to understand what's going on. We can't.
Cambridge Housing Authority is coming up with proposed financing plans for the need for the redevelopment of Linden Chambers. And they're also coming up with the refinancing plans for the HUD project. So both HUD and DHCD supplemented projects are being, in terms of what they're doing in terms of proposed financing plans, Cambridge Housing Authority is their consultant.
And the last thing is a comment. I personally want you, as everybody listening, to know, and I think it's widely agreed to around this table. I think we're all very supportive of making this all happen. We're just trying to understand the financing and the project.
I know,
So
I have
just
no
wanna make
doubt
sure it's
about that.
clear.
I have no doubt about that at all. These are all, these are well taken comments, and I hope that I'm not reflecting any, I don't think that I am.
No, you're not. I just want to make sure that.
These are good questions.
I think the goal is when we get to town meeting, is everything in line? Are the eyes dotted?
That's really what
T's
this process is
crossed?
about.
Are we ready to prove our case to
Mr.
and
Chair.
pros and cons so people understand? So we understand.
That's a great segue. We're 12 people or so. We've spent almost an hour, gotten 3 articles. Does it make sense, since there's one entity that's been hired to do all of this, would it make sense to combine a spin-off of what John said earlier, 17, 18, and 19, package it all together and present it in a way that town meeting, all 200 and some of them, can understand? If we're not limited by what we need to do, and if that same entity is going to do all 3, would it make sense? One package number divided into different things, maybe a little longer description. It might make it easier for town meeting to digest.
That's an excellent point and a good question, and I know that we received the applications, and so we put them in the queue. That's
If we
basically
can do it legally,
right. Okay, so we'll examine it.
Moreover, just building on that, that would limit the chance that 2 of them get passed and 1 doesn't. And you don't want that.
That's true.
Jim, did you have comments?
I did not.
Okay. I think that's. Article
Okay.
19.
So,
Oh, John, I'm sorry. I
John,
skipped you.
No, I'm good.
Okay, you're good.
Article 20. This was the request for funding to purchase East Militia Heights Drive property. We received correspondence from the Housing Authority last week notifying us that they, as a board, had requested to withdraw the article. So we are going to be, we'll vote on that on a meeting on the 30th.
Did they say why?
Yeah, I actually, we received 2 pieces of correspondence. One was, that's a good question, actually, because there was correspondence that we had received from Charles River Center informing us, I'm stretching my memory a little bit here, but informing us that they were going to aggressively bid for the project, for the property. I think it's kind of a known secret if that's the case. And it's probably well known around town, given the profile of Charles River Center, that's a property that they're interested in. It's contiguous to their property. They would anticipate, and the letter also included some anticipated future uses if Charles River was a successful bidder, including developing housing for developmentally challenged individuals. And again, you probably all know this, that Charles River Center provides services to those individuals. They've got, I think, 11 or 20 sites in this kind of Metro West area. We have our Bricks and Bones is a member on the board and is voluntarily recused himself concerning the discussion regarding that. But we received that correspondence, and the correspondence also included that they had been in discussions with the Needham Housing Authority about a memorandum of understanding regarding cooperatively using the property to meet the long and short-term goals of each of the entities. And so they'll be working on that. So that was one correspondence. The other correspondence that we received from the Housing Authority included basically the same thing, that we're, as I recall. I don't have it in front of me.
So
but
they're
it's part of-
bowing out because the Charles River Center wants to bid? Okay,
Who owns the property?
is that the bottom line? Okay,
That's what it sounds like.
okay.
Sorry for too many words. Is my
I just heard Rick ask who
Yeah,
who currently
who
owns
owns the property right now?
US Army.
So
They're putting it out to bid. The RFP
Yeah.
has not been issued yet. No one knows exactly when the RFP will be issued, when it is issued. What they have to sell the property at least at market value. They will have an appraisal, and that's how those bids go.
The town is not interested in being a bidder.
How many acres is
this was the Housing Authority.
Yeah, I
The
know.
town has not, I've
3.5
not
acres.
heard anything from the town.
It's-
No.
The town hasn't expressed an interest in it. I don't think the town
They're not gonna be
generally
able to
wants to
afford
be
it.
in the housing business.
Not gonna be able to afford it.
It's a better use. That's just that's the short end.
Okay.
answer.
Why don't we move on then?
Okay,
Mr.
Article
Chairman,
21.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman, just clarification, since there was so much talk, I've been trying to figure out why there's a difference in the articles and in the article information. The original articles were prepared with the very first draft that was done. The language which town meeting is voting back in December. The article information have been provided by advocates in the last couple of weeks, and as we get the information and was put in here, the actual proofreading the two to make sure they match. That's coming with the next version. The original amounts were actually based off of the eligibility project applications, and the numbers matched the project applications. And CPC clearly through their process had further conversations with the requester and modified the amounts.
All right, so that's what we normally do. As the process goes along, we don't actually amend, we don't ask them to amend the application, but we'll change the number. And all the numbers that I'm quoting you are the numbers that were the numbers that were going to be requested, and we went through those on the second of March.
This is being withdrawn, right?
Correct.
It is.
Article 21.
Article 21 is going to, Article 21 is being withdrawn.
Oh,
No,
21.
Article 21 is the growing bins.
Oh, no, sorry.
Going.
You know what?
Thank you.
I was, sorry, I'm looking at mine. Okay, sorry, I'm working from my memo and I was cutting and pasting. Okay, the appropriate for community farm growing beds. It's a application by the Needham Community Farm to develop 150 growing beds over a 3/4 acre parcel immediately contiguous to about a 3/4 acre so parcel that they're currently cultivating. This is a new program which would actually construct these beds, some of which would be available for physically challenged individuals. And in fact, the development includes a path that makes it accessible to all community members. And the beds would be leased directly to individuals to be used for their own use. And it's just kind of similar to the way community farms are used in urban areas. It's similar to what you would do in the Fens or in other urban areas. You would lease a bed and grow vegetables, etc. So the request is for $200,000. I think that the memo indicates that the sense of the committee has to get some education. This is a new program. We had looked and we had suggested perhaps funding over a couple of year period. We went back and spoke to the applicant regarding that, and they didn't see the economies of scale in doing that, and so they're going forward. We'd like to go forward with the request for the full funding amount. And the detail of it is, is up there as part of that 600-page packet, but I think there's an index to it. There was I will say this, there was some question, we had a kind of a question of, well, if you build it, what's the basis for it? What's the marketability of this, right? And, this is everyone here knows what the Needham Community Farms is and what it does, but it relies greatly on a lot of volunteer work. Has some staff, they would have a staff are working, a production staff are working with this project. But the question that I kind of had was, well, are you going to be able to lease? Is there demand here for 150 of these leasing beds? And there are two points that I think it's worth noting. One is that they noted to us that that the Wellesley has a similar program and it's oversubscribed. And then we received, many emails from community members saying that they would lease a bed. So there's a lot of public support. So I think that's, in terms of our perspective and what we do, I think that's relevant.
So I have a question. I personally support the Needham Community Farm. I think it's a great organization. I think that tax dollars should be used to benefit the public in general, without an entrance fee. And I feel like they're going to be leased. So that's in essence an entrance fee. So how?
So there's going to be a two-tier fee, and so there'll be accommodation for people on the question of affordability, but there's one of that kind of runs a little head on into some of our questions, which was, well, if you're asking for $200,000 to build 150 cedar beds and they're going to rot out after 10 or 15 years, what's the plan? How are you going to sustain this program? And so we put pressure on them to talk about how to fund it, so our perspective was, well, we want to get you up and running. So it's not, you could look at it as a jungle gym, right? A source of leisure for members of the community.
That was gonna be my question. What purpose of CPA does this serve?
Well, actually, the language of the open space includes a specific reference to supporting community farms. I mean, there's actually a reference in the language of the statute.
Are there any other grants that you've made or the town meeting has approved that requires citizens to then pay to use the benefit that you've created?
Rosemary Pool.
Okay.
Pool, sports, all the.
But that's the town, again, that's the town, not a separate entity receiving the funds. So we're using tax dollars to fund something that the town then receives the money back from, not an outside entity. And this outside entity, the town has provided a lot of benefits to. And I also personally, I think that they should be fundraising outside of tax dollars. We're already subsidizing basically the land that is being used for this,
Their lease of land is what, Dave, again?
$1.
Yeah.
$1.
Not a bad deal.
Is there no data in
So the question that you have is why the entrance? Why the lease?
there? What is the entrance?
No, it was.
I would be stronger. I would say, as long as there's an anticipated entrance fee, I can't support this.
Did it help me in that, Josh? Is it because it's a non-town entity or,
Because
and how would you distinguish if it isn't? How do you distinguish a process?
using, I
We
mean,
spent a lot more money.
we did. I think that
I think the
I
money
think
should
of
go to the town.
Rosemary as a town asset. And the community beds is adjacent to a town asset. I mean, we work closely with them. But to the extent that we're using tax dollars to pay for a benefit, it should be a benefit to all residents of the town.
People that use the
Accessible.
fields, we use some CPA money for the fields, but the people who use it pay the money into Park and Rec and we use it.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think if this were linked to maintenance costs and so forth, it makes sense because then it to some extent self-funds going forward.
So I think the odd thing about the request, so they're developing a different program. They're developing a new program. The way they can deliver it to the community is by getting a grant request that will actually construct this thing. But in order for the program to be financially viable for Needham Community Farms, they need some revenue stream. That's basically it. I mean, you're saying to them, you shouldn't be collecting a revenue stream.
They
So
can
now-
collect the revenue stream, but just not rely on tax dollars to set it up.
It's gotta be one way or the other.
Isn't, to some degree, isn't that what happened, that what's happened with the farm in general? Some taxpayer dollars are helped to fund the farm, but then some of those vegetables are sold.
So just, there are going to be beds that are available to SNAP recipients that are not going to be free of charge. And I'm just stretching my memory, and there's a distinction between $75 and $150 a year on a leasing cost, but I don't know what it is. But you're saying any lease cost is you object. I don't.
For tax.
Okay,
So go ahead.
I mean, I can ask another question. It's not directly on that, but how does it work? Do they have to do the work and then they get reimbursed for it? Or do we, I'm using the term we, but just say,
Yeah, so
do we give them 200,000 without any control over what
so
they
it's-
might spend
it's
it on?
it's similar to what I've said before, which is a drawdown. They've got to prove that they got to show us receipts. It's literally, there's it's like a yellow sheet where you staple the receipts and then you get your reimbursement from the town.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we have to
So
remember-
we don't
that's
give
our
them-
control over the fact that we're going to use the 200 to actually do this.
That's the control, right? And there, again, there's a grant, so there's a grant agreement, and then there's reps and warranties and a certification that have to be signed by a representative who's non-governmental.
Something along those.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I think we have to remember something, and I understand what you're saying about funding, is it public, is it private? As far as why you're doing something, it has to do with making sure people understand the value of what these are. For example, let's say they don't charge anything, people sign up. The odds are that's the value they see. And so how much will they actually use to the degree that they're supposed to be? The best example I had is a long time ago, a friend someone came to town, a friend had a dog, couldn't keep it. So I took the dog in, but then he was just gone. He was gone. The dog's in my possession. This person is gone. Now I have to figure out what to do with him because I couldn't keep him at the time. So I went to an organization in Worcester that has dogs that are for to help people handicapped accessibility and so forth. And they said, well, this dog is not appropriate for us. But what they said was, whatever you do not give the dog away. You're not gonna find a person that values that dog. So whatever you do, make sure you sell the dog. Make sure you put a price on it. Because then you're gonna find people that value the dog. It's a very similar thing with, let's say, these garden beds. Put some type of value on it, then you have people that value the beds and the time that they're gonna spend and actually use them and put them to good use. So why? I mean, that would certainly be probably the reason of why, besides the fact that the funds could be used in other things in the garden, within the community garden itself. So there's a very good reason of why you don't want to just say, here, take them, just sign up, they're free. Except of course, there are going to be some set aside for people that truly need them because they can't afford them. So that's a separate thing, but that's why you want to put value something so people will value it back.
All right, so I note that the yearly license fee is $100.
I'm gonna try something off the wall here. Why not? I think the concern is we're funding something with the revenue stream going to a non-town entity. Is it possible for the town to set up a revolving fund, which this money would come into, and that fund will be dedicated to supporting this activity? So it does come into the town.
So I wouldn't support it no matter what. Just so we're clear. It doesn't make any difference. So,
But I think his question just, can it be
Yeah.
done as opposed, I don't think he's
Yeah,
asking
and
if
can
to
it be
support it or
done?
not.
I can't imagine how it could be.
how could you
You
do
can
that?
have a revolving fund for the purpose of supporting private organizations.
Yeah.
It has to be a public.
Thought it might be a problem, but
Yeah.
wanted to ask the question.
You're
So
thinking outside the box.
can I ask a question again about the community farm? Where is it that it's in the statute?
So Louise, I don't have the statute in front of me, but I could get that
Okay,
statutory
if you could-
reference to you,
If you could,
if that's okay.
Well,
Um,
would this also be an open space and recreation?
So, it's not an easy read, right, on the CPA. It's not, so but I will find.
Another 600 pages?
No, it's not, it's just really, it's very
So-
different.
Page 509.
Mr. Chair,
It's a whole lot.
Can I ask you a question? I just, because there's been a lot of different opinions, can we get a summary of where the finance committee is coming down on this?
Oh, I mean, I think that my opinion really rests a lot on the fees.
Okay,
I think that's a big linchpin. I think I've heard that from some other people, but I've heard the contrary as well, that some people would support it without any changes regardless of the fees. I think for the committee, the finance committee, it would be beneficial to hear directly from the applicants at some point, probably. I mean, I think we should ask these questions of them as soon as possible, and then have them come in on the 6th as well. Ask them to come in on the 6th before we vote.
So, I just was handed the reference, it's under definition of recreational use rather than open space, so I misspoke. But under recreational use, the definition includes the use of land for community gardens. And then from there, there's language about supporting, it's pretty broadly defined in terms of supporting recreational use.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions about this? Comments? Okay. Tennis court.
Okay. Now. Tennis court. So this is a request for $50,000 to assess the Needham High tennis courts. There's 4 courts. We, through our due diligence, we got an estimate of the actual repairs being costing anywhere between $500,000 to $1.5 million. And it depends on what their evaluation reveals. The upper range reflects an entire reconstruction of the 4 tennis courts. The lower range is more of a surface, deals with the surface, but the indications that we've gotten is that the courts are pretty severely compromised. So with that, I think you saw what the presentation for the select board. We had a discussion about that because this committee, when we're looking at whether or not we fund Emery Grover at 3 million or 6 million, have be spending 1.5 million on 4 tennis courts. That's the next warrant article. That kind of jumped out at us, and everyone basically there was a lot of sentiment that they would support the $50,000 for design funds, but funding $1.5 million to reconstruct 4 tennis courts would be, I think the word is a push. So it may be, I think that where we may end up on that is that CPC would be funding a part of that. We had tracked it in our own, we have our own internal capital, plan. So we had tracked it, I think, at $500,000. I think that's what we had tracked it at.
Over what time period would those funds be spent?
So I think it's this year they're going to do the analysis, and next year they're going to come and ask for the funds. It's like this year and then next
Push it
year.
off.
Oh, we pushed it off a year. Okay, so we pushed it off. So it's not next year, but the year following.
This would be in their master plan, right?
Who's the master plan?
The school's master plan, since it's 1 million in terms of restoration, is that anywhere in their master plan?
So what we have understood, and if there may be somebody here who else can speak to this, is that this is a park and rec application, because park and rec basically administers and controls the facility. There's a lot of public use of the property, and so it's not, and that was a question that was raised by a couple of members of our committee, which was, well, wait a minute, shouldn't this be part of an expenditure by the Needham by the public schools? That's a question that we've raised, but I think the short answer we got was, well, Park and Rec is administering it, so it's a Park and Rec application.
It would be helpful in that context to have some breakdown of the amount of time exclusively devoted to high school versus the amount of time available for the public.
I think that was provided to us.
Okay.
Because that was a question also.
Yeah.
How about an explanation, or where would I find, how did the courts end up in this condition that, within 10 years of their construction, that they're totally have to be reconstructed again?
So that's, I'm glad you asked that question, but we're not the, I guess that would be a due diligence question, but at the same time, remember, we're not the maintenance crew, right? We're
I'm
not,
not-
wait, no, but it's a good, it's a very.
I didn't ask it that you.
Oh, I know, yeah, I know, but that's we haven't asked the why question, although we did ask questions about what the maintenance was on the tennis court. And we got what I would call kind of a thin response. The maintenance efforts on the courts themselves. I
So
think
why
that's-
would we ever consider doing it again? So the same
But-
lack of maintenance could happen again?
I think that my thinking on that is there's been that would be, I think, an appropriate maybe a response. But the problem is it's a little bit like sanctions, like you may be punishing the wrong people. So it's
Okay.
No, keep going.
so because I don't,
We'll make
what
a
are we gonna
recorded
say
video.
then? So what do you, at that point, what do you say? You say that the high school doesn't get their tennis courts anymore? I mean, what do you say, right? I mean, I don't mean to be glib, but what's the sanction? Right?
But the question, I think, is whether it is appropriate to use CPA funds for the projects, not whether or not the town will do it. It's
Versus
whether,
another source of funds. I
yeah,
think the question is about the source of.
it's
funds.
the sort, yeah, that's what it is.
But well,
Because we haven't, if something was maintenance, we have stated that we would not fund it with CPA funding. CPA monies. So how is this different? I guess
I'm
is our
sorry, I
question.
missed that.
Yeah, I think that's the question. How is this different?
What's it, I mean, what is it?
Is the question, as a policy, do we fund maintenance through CPC funds?
No.
No, the answer is no.
No,
This isn't maintenance.
no, but it's not, no.
So the incentive here is to just let everything
Yes,
I,
yes.
go,
that's-
and now we
Yes.
can use CPA funds.
I can't speak to the administration before.
I think that pretty much hits the head in there. It's a nail.
Right?
but I
Yes.
mean, that's
So it's a reasonable question of Park and Rec
Yeah.
on how they plan to take care of it.
So
If they
can I
use
ask it in a
that.
different way, which is, and I thought this was, I didn't mean to say anything. I did.
Yeah.
You didn't, don't worry.
Tell me
That
this,
was-
you
he had
have-
to
That was
go anyway.
coincidental,
It's okay. He had to
I'm
go
pretty
anyway.
Okay, I didn't, all right, sorry.
Jim, you may have to coach back.
So well, the way I was gonna bring this up was the line item called maintenance. But where is that? Because that's what, where is it in the budget?
Well, they actually might get a new person to go
So
to all the
that's-
fields and maybe the
Right,
tennis
that's
courts are
the
involved.
Right, where is it?
Give trash along the way.
You didn't maintain these courts. Okay. What are we gonna do in the future? Where's the
But
line item?
I don't, but why is that your responsibility?
It's
No,
not my
he's not- he's asking the
responsibility.
questions.
That's why,
Right.
but I think, isn't it kind of your responsibility?
It
I mean,
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's-
It is.
yeah.
That's why we're
Yes,
asking.
that's why we're asking.
So,
It's
so what
not,
what we're saying is part of our due diligence is you're looking for funding on this. Prove to us that you've been doing your job along the way.
Or show us that you'll be able.
and that you
Or that you
will
will in the
going
future.
forward.
By doing
Forward, really.
But that's where I worry about the sanctions part of it, right?
Don't use that word.
All right,
It's not the right- it's not the-
I-
Don't insinuate that anything that we do is sanctions. So I
Okay,
just,
I'm John,
so please, don't use that word.
Well, I didn't want to say no funding for you because you didn't maintain it. But I'm worried. I just don't know how to do
That's
that.
not what we're saying either. The question is, how did it get to this condition? And then how are we assured that if this money is to be spent,
Mhm.
that a similar group 10 years from now won't be in the
Won't
same
be asked,
place?
yeah. And
That's
those
all the
que-
question is. It's
Yeah.
nothing.
Phrase, good money after that.
So it's no more elaborate than that.
So, and
Those
this is the
questions
question for
were-
Park and Rec. It's not you.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
to, but those questions were asked as we evaluated the efficacy of this project.
And we'll ask again, so.
That's
we'll have
perfectly
that
appropriate.
information.
Yeah.
Okay,
Stacy is on the
so,
phone.
Would you see,
So-
would you see it in your role to say no to this? Given what we've just talked about here, would you would you consider saying no to this?
I'm trying to get to a solution. If they need four, I guess.
Well, let them come to
So the-
another source.
I guess, yeah, there are other funding sources that we have. We have the operating budget, we have capital budgets, we have reserve funds, so.
This is not the first, time this has come up.
So
Where we question, why are they coming to us? Where's the maintenance along the line? Why should we be looking at this now? It's a very valid question, very valid concern that if the maintenance hasn't been there along the way they're supposed to, why are we funding? Why is the CPC?
So the
funding?
purpose of the $50,000 is really to decide whether you need to spend 500,000 or whether you need to spend $1.5 million. The appropriateness of whether to spend any amount of money really goes to the height of the question of what are we going to do and how are we going to maintain it? $50,000, one way or the other, is just really to define the scope of work. And that's all we're doing here is funding that definition. And then how it gets paid for, whether it gets paid for, whether it's just covered over and made additional parking spaces is up to, you folks in town meeting later on.
Thank you. Next is boat launch.
Boat launch.
Is
It's
it-
going to be.
Is Celebrity or Royal Caribbean gonna back at this thing?
This is gonna make the Jungle Cruise at Disneyland look like a.
So, they're gonna vote, the parking rent's gonna vote on that one.
Thank you, Mr. Applicant. So Article 24, Emery Broker.
Okay, Emery Grove.
That's fun.
And as I said to you earlier, I know there are a lot of different funding sources. We may discuss some of them other than CPC, but I do hope that the focus is on communicating to the CPC our opinion for their funds. That should be
Yeah,
the
for
primary
those,
focus.
that funding source for the
Yeah.
project.
So I don't want to waste too much of your time on talking with the other ones.
Yeah, please go.
Okay, that's
Nothing first.
so the project, Emery Grover one was originally a request to us where the applicable funding amount from CPA would be $12 million.
You might have skipped one. I'm sorry, do we go past the ball? I missed something?
Being withdrawn.
Oh, you're a kid, there, Tom.
No,
You're a
I'm sorry, I
kid.
didn't hear it.
You're a kid.
And then this is the second, this is Emery Grover two, which is, folks know all about it, which is just a rehab and reconstruction of the original core building. That under the formula provided to us by the town, we'll refer to them as Needham Public School, had an eligibility number of something like 18 million out of the $22 million. Under the kind of broadly interpreted wording of the historic preservation provision to the Community Preservation Act. They've requested $6 million. We did our own in the course of our due diligence. We had, by the way, we have liaisons on all these projects, and we had an architect, Bob Germany, and Joe Barnes, who's a retired school administrator as the liaisons. But one of their due diligence questions was, okay, since you're kind of gutting, this is a complete gut, you're just dealing with the shell, and we're gonna end up with a shell, and you're basically putting an entirely new building and structure inside of it. What's the cost of the facade, the shell, the roof, the accessibility questions? And so there's a pro forma breakdown, which is part of their presentation, which shows it's just north of $6 million. So we felt like that was even though eligibility costs, in fairness, under the language of the act and the way we funded the town hall, it was much more significant than that. It was $18 million. We didn't really dig too deeply, but it seemed to make sense. But we wanted to examine this number and say, because it's been projects is a little different than that town hall, because there was a lot of elements of the town hall that are still there, that are actually restored. As I kind of glibly said, but the floors still squeak and the banisters there, and the walls there. But this is going to be somewhat different than that. So we came up with there's a number that they had applied for, which is $6 million, and that matched up really well with what we thought was appropriate. And you remember in my presentation last year, which we were trying to kind of come up with some sort of formula, because how do we look at these projects? But in terms of percentages, I think Louise said maybe the delta between building a new box and restoring the old box. And this may be, this is there are a lot of other experts on this. There are other experts around me on this, but this may be one of those unique projects, it seems like, where it's the same number. It has to do with the uniqueness of the building and the site and all that kind of stuff, but looks like it doesn't look like there's a significant delta between restoring this building and building a new box. So that's not really a good formula. And so we then looked at it from a different perspective, but all of it with an eye towards the fact that there was no way that we would be in a financial position to fund this program at this requested $18 million. And the public schools came in asking for $6 million. That was kind of a flag that we put in the ground last year as a discussion point. And that's the application came in and kind of matched up with our analysis. So then we're at the second part, which is, okay, so what do we do? Can we fund that? And the request, the sense of the committee was basically $3 to $6 million, depending on whether or not we can do this. So that's where that's what the sense of the committee is. There's a lot of support for it. They want to see the building. I want to tell you that at the public hearing, there was a lot of support, really eloquent support for people in support of the project. And so there was, I would call it strong community support. We've been working with the finance director and Rick, former member of your committee, has been working with us on putting together some financial summaries. And one proposal that we're working with is funding part of it through debt and part of it through cash. And if I could speak just kind of in general terms on the debt part, if we fund it by debt let's say it's $3 million. As we wind down town hall, then the service number on that bond obligation would roughly equal what our reserve fund and the required amount is on historic preservation. So you're not drawing from general reserves, but we're going to get to about 2029 to fully wind down the bond requirements of town hall. This year, by the way, is the first year where the allocation of historic preservation exceeds our bond obligation on town hall. So it's winding down. Okay. So questions?
So when do you determine whether you'll be supporting 3 million, 6 million, or something in between?
That is the subject of our discussion on the 30th
Of March?
Next Wednesday.
And will that be voted upon at that point in time? Because I'm only asking because obviously whether the number is 19.4, the overall number, or something different, which we still don't know that yet, it's going to be broken out. And so for us to have the discussions about how it's being broken out, we're going to need to know what it is you guys are.
I know, but I don't want to, we're going to have to go through that process, but that's going to be part of the process on the 30th. And we're going to be working with financial models that we're getting from our finance director beforehand, but we'll have them beforehand, but we're going to discuss them on the 30th.
Oh.
That, I don't know.
Are we voting on the next one?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're voting.
I
on it.
hope that we're going to be able to discuss and vote.
So
Okay.
I have a question maybe for Dave. Depending upon whatever the CPC decides, how much of free cash and their free cash and how much of their debt to, I'm sorry, I'm saying this incorrectly, how much cash and how much bonding they should use. If there is any slack such that there's not enough where would the remaining funds come from? Would it, because we have other funding sources, we have free cash, we have borrowing. Do you have any sense of where that would be made up?
At this point, it would be increasing the amount to borrow from within the levy limit.
Okay.
That was the message that we received from the select board as well, because we raised that question, which is what would happen if we're not going to fund the full $6 million, and that was the answer, which I think really pushes us to searching out a way for us to fund the full $6 million, but I don't want to, I mean, I think that we're going to put together a scenario that reflects that, but I don't want to, I don't want to truncate the process. I want to allow our committee members to review those financial summaries and vote on them.
Go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, I'm a little confused as to what our role here in this is, in that we've had a broad vote to go ahead with Henry Grover, yet there are a number of articles. Do we look at them in isolation, or do we need all the articles in front of us to make a rational process out of this? This is another 4.5 for Henry Grover construction design. I just don't want to go at this by the time and find out, oh, wait a minute, this is some huge thing coming down that we weren't aware of, but
Yeah.
I'd like to get a better sense of the whole picture rather than vote on a piecemeal.
My comment is purely a CPA comment. So I think what would be really helpful is to get from you what the historic preservation, what that value is to CPC. Because that's really what you're funding, is this the historic part. What the building is used for is almost irrelevant to CPC, right? Because you're trying to determine if the funds can be used for a particular purpose and what the historic value is of the building.
That was the 6.2.
Yeah,
I
that's the
think
So
you
that's the
referred to.
6.2 million.
Yeah.
Okay,
We feel that with certainty.
okay,
Although, but
perfect.
we feel that
So
with certainty.
anything
Anything
up
beyond
to
that,
6.2 million is you're very comfortable falls within.
yeah, if I could, Peter,
Yeah.
to build on that question a bit. So we've held that the $6 million number would be the number we try
Yeah.
and work through. It then became a financial issue with us.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with historic preservation or anything like that. It's, can we afford to fund $6 million out of the CPA buckets to come up with the right number? And that's when we went through, what happens if the fund, we can't fund that. Well, we can only fund 3 million.
Mhm.
And then we looked at, well, can we fund 6 million cash? The answer to that is no.
Okay.
So now we have to look at a combination of cash plus debt. How much, can we do it all with debt? Well, that would also hurt us, as well as we look down the road to some of the other things we want to do. So that's where we get into looking at, well, maybe we look at 3 million cash, 3 million debt. Where does the 3 million cash come from? Well, we take 2.25 out of free cash, 750 out of the general reserve for this year,
Mhm.
because we've got the funds available to do that. And that's when we ran all of the scenarios out for 5 years, which resulted in deferring some future requests for park and rec money, for example, to do the renovation of the Broadmeadow and Elliott fields. We looked at some of the other projects that were on the books, and we wound up having to defer them. We had to factor in what would happen with some of the requests for money for the affordable housing.
Mhm.
So we really got into the question of, we don't have enough casing to eat the 6-pound sausage. So how do we want to divvy that up and come up with the right number? And that's what we've been working on. And that's what we've asked Dave for a little additional input. And maybe it might not be 3 and 3, maybe it might be 4 million and 2 million, 4 million debt, 2 million. But that's a type of analysis, because once we determine 6 million was the right number, then the question is, how do you pay for it? And if we can't pay for it, what's the alternative? And ask the same question as to what happens if you don't. So,
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Okay, before I leave, I just want to ask one last question. I want to return it, because I want to get a better sense of what you folks are suggesting with respect to. Get some direction on this. So you're saying that if we turn it down, there are other potential funding sources for the whole,
We have, I guess, a capital improvement fund. Would that be eligible? I don't know. Go ahead, Dave.
It could be, but the tennis courts at the high school are part of the capital plan. And the requested source to move forward with the project is CPA. But it is in the capital plan and it has been there. And that was the recommended source, hence the application to the CPC.
Okay, I just want to get,
But the underlying question doesn't go away if it's a different source of funds. The underlying question is still there. Are we throwing money away?
Right.
If there isn't a decent maintenance program.
but I think that that's, and what I say is that that's a broader question, I think, right? Because it doesn't, I asked the question of, well, what about the other transports? What is their status? Are those ports being, what's the status of those ports? Are they being maintained? So I think that we, that's the question that I think for you folks, and I guess maybe it's us as well, which is what is the maintenance program? And is there a line on a budget?
Does everybody understand if you said 500 to $1.5 million? Does the 500 mean that the maintenance has been okay and that just every 10 years we need to spend 500,000? Or does $1.5 million mean that does $1.5 million in the first?
I don't think that 500,000 reflects that the maintenance has been okay.
I guess my bigger question is.
What's the life cycle?
What's the life
To
cycle?
e-
We
even
have,
if
we just
well-maintained.
spent a lot of money on the track to resurface it.
Right.
After midway
10
through
years,
its life.
11 years.
But that actually is a good example because that was maintained. We did extend it. We did this in the appropriate investment. We did extend it out to we're going to extend it out to the max life. That kind of all made sense because, but this one, those are good questions.
Yeah, I just don't know if the $500,000 is the same thing as the track. That's after 10 years, you have to put $500,000 to let it. Its full life of 20 or whatever.
Good question. Good question.
I don't mean to belabor. I just wanted to know what questions we should have asked or other, and what would happen if we did certain actions. That's it.
But don't we have to spend the 50,000 to start to find out what the problem with the court is? What we do with that information is another issue, but don't we need to find out what the problems are?
And it's a question of what source of funding
Right.
you use, the $50,000. You get it from the town, you get it from CPA.
Right.
50,000 isn't gonna make or break our budget.
Go ahead, John.
Oh, that was what you, Ricky said. I just want to circle back, and it's more for the committee than not necessarily for Peter, but if you're looking at Article 24 in the warrant that was presented to us, in the assumption of the article as it's presently written is that 19.4 million will be what is requested to fund the reconstruction or the renovation of Emery Grover, plus the work at Hillside. And currently, right now, without any CPA funding, that 19.4 would consist of the 4.5 free cash, 1 million from overlay, and 13.9 to be borrowed. If 6 million came in, am I understanding correctly that then our discussion would be of whether we would be reducing the borrowing component or reducing the free cash component or a combination of the two? Is that, I just want to make sure I understand, is that what we'll be discussing here as a finance committee?
Dave,
Excuse me, I would expect the first phase is the CPC, whether or not they want to be a contributor to the cost of the project. And the next phase is having the proponents coming in to speak to the need and the purpose of funding it. And based on the assumption the total project cost is $19.4 million, it is looking at that that there would be $5.5 million in general fund cash resources, and the balance being funded $13.9 million of debt service, which is assuming 6 million is for CPC supported debt, and then 7.9 million would be general fund supported debt. If CPC were to support funding at $6 million, and if they were to support 3 million would be by debt and 3 million would be by other CPA resources, the debt number of 13.9 would be reduced by 3 million. So a total of 10.9, of which 3 million would be supported by CPA receipts in the future years. And one of those X's that are in the body of the language, because they would identify the funding source, would have the amount of $3 million.
So with the, and if maybe I can sympathize and pardon me for, maybe not getting it totally, but however the CPA monies are allocated, whether it's through CPA borrowing or CPA free cash or CPA general reserve, however that amounts to, that would, as it's being contemplated by the proponents of the article, would reduce the 13.9 borrowing, or would be a component of the
It's a
13.9,
component of
component of
13.9.
the 13.9 borrowing.
Correct.
Okay. And then the discussion we will have with the proponents is whether or not they're proposing 4.5 of free cash be used. And a discussion will be as to whether that's the appropriate funding mechanism.
Correct. If there was, it's actually a total of 5.5 million in cash. It's 4.4 in, 4.5 million in free cash and $1 million from overlay surplus. And to any amount that the cash is reduced, that would increase the 13.9 number.
We are gonna have a full discussion on all these funding sources.
Yes.
That was my question.
Yeah. we will.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you for indulging me on that.
Yeah, I guess my thought is, for the purpose of helping the CPC, to the extent that debt is a concern for the finance committee, the use of cash is beneficial in reducing the debt burden.
But at the same, I won't
No.
preview the discussion.
I know, I feel like I'm.
No, but if you
jumping
have-
a little bit.
No, I think when you have an asset
Something
that's a 50-year asset, I think that the borrowing component of it is really needs to be considered as the main source of what the funding for it should be. And I also think to accurately portray sort of what's being put into these projects, the borrowing component, so we can identify, going forward, who's spending what on what. At least to my simple mind, the easiest way to allocate it is when you identify what the borrowing aspect of it is.
So irrespective of our.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with you
financial-
guys.
No, but it does prompt a question. From your perspective as a finance committee, if you're providing guidance to us, are we better off putting more weight, if we can, on debt or on cash?
I'm just gonna give you my personal, 1 out of 9
Sure.
debt.
Yeah.
This is not a
Yeah,
survey.
exactly.
it's-
No, I know it's not a survey, and I know it's not a,
But
I'm looking for a sense of the committee, how's that?
No,
So
that's it.
it's a pretty large amount of money relative to CPA funds.
Correct.
And so really the question, like, there's one question that has to do with the asset itself. And I completely agree with what John just said regarding borrowing for those types of assets. But the other thing is, if you use up, let's say, $4.5 million of cash, where does that put you next year?
Correct.
That's, and that's really,
And that's where we
yeah,
struggle. And that's why the question was asked, is, as you're looking at, I mean, you're the financial gurus of the town. And as you're looking at that and you're seeing, I mean, I think it's fairly simple to understand our dilemma here.
Mhm.
Because if we spend too much cash, we don't have enough to do projects. If we put too much debt, then that just further exacerbates down the road what we're trying to do. So that's why I'm saying, if there's any insight here, we'd appreciate hearing
Yeah,
it.
we're.
so
looking for-
if we weren't going to CPA, if we weren't looking at CPA funding, we would be borrowing the whole thing. We would be borrowing that $6 million that's not coming from CPA.
Okay.
So I don't think you're putting us in a bad position by borrowing.
No, I just, again, we're just looking, because we gotta make a decision.
Well,
Can I-
so we put you in a bad position to have you borrow more though.
Yeah, so don't we, I mean.
No, it's gonna come out to be the same.
No, but Louis,
Not to
Louis,
us. Well,
no, I have a question, Louis. So we do have anticipated other projects coming down the pike that would be funded through debt. So the more we spend, the more debt we issue now
And if
means,
it's within the
but-
levy,
That's, but if it's the 10%, it gets dropped into the
It- it-
10% bucket.
either way.
Yeah.
So if there's room within the levy, it doesn't matter. We
current,
just have surplus within the levy.
Yeah, if we finance this $6 million totally with debt, okay, that's gonna affect the 10% and the 3% number, correct?
Oh, won't it's affected? Yeah, it'll affect both of them.
Just the 10%.
10%.
So by us contributing 3 million in cash, we help alleviate to a degree,
The 10%,
10%.
yes. That's correct.
Okay. I just, so we gotta understand it. I've got to translate this for the folks in the committee.
Thank you.
Okay, is that it?
For me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Art.
Thanks, guys.
You guys
Thank
you so much.
CPA,
Thanks, everyone.
I think
Thanks,
that's-
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks,
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, John.
No, that's all right.
Okay.
I know, I know. Just,
Even the stuff you're supporting, it looks like we're in fight. We're totally supportive. By the way, why are you doing that?
Okay, so the next article is public facilities maintenance program.
Is which one?
Public facilities here. Yeah, public facilities maintenance. Safety facility. What article?
It's Article 5.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia.
Yeah, I'd be here for them anyway, so.
Are these numbers gonna change because of what's on there?
I think number 5 is set.
Yeah, probably.
Go ahead, Cecilia, if you want to intro.
Yeah, so basically I'm here just to talk about, we put in another request for another $1 million in the facility maintenance warrant article for FY '23. Give you guys kind of an update on where we are with spending on FY '22's facility maintenance warrant article. Wish there was a shorter way to say that. And then kind of what we're anticipating spending on FY '23, barring any emergencies and whatnot. So we have not spent down all of FY '22 warrant article, but that is because there are projects that we are anticipating putting out to bid within the next month that will spend down that money. So kind of the way it's funding because of all of our work in the schools and having a huge construction season within the summer, kind of half the warrant article goes to the first year, and then the second half of the warrant article is really spent in the second year because we are limited in what we can do not in the summertime for some of the bigger projects. So some projects we've spent the money on so far already is the library cupola restoration. We did the town hall clock cleaning and painting out here. We've replaced some of the sun deflectors on the outside of the cap, so those wood pieces that just kind of stick out. We did some switch upgrades for our buildings in order to accommodate time clocks. We painted and replaced ceiling tiles all throughout the Mitchell classrooms. We did some flooring replacements in some schools. And then we are looking at putting out a flooring replacement in additional schools. So kind of what we do is we find areas as they tend to wear and replace portions instead of trying to replace an entire floor in an entire school over the summer. So we have some flooring replacements that we are working on putting out to bid in the next couple of weeks for the Pollard, Elliott, and the Broad Meadow. The high school cupola, we're designing and repairing that. We had initially tried to do that last summer and there was a little bit of lead that we needed to deal with. So we are going back and designing that so we can have the lead removed. And then the duct cleaning, which is just our annual duct cleaning at the town hall in the Newman this year. Looking at replacing one of the boilers at the high school. So kind of the way I have it set up right now is we're in this design stage of that. The design will come out of this year and the construction will come out of next year's facility maintenance warrant article. And then looking at replacing some of the heat wheels at the Newman. So that's an energy recovery aspect of the HVAC system. They just failed over time. And they just need to be replaced. So the whole unit doesn't need to be replaced, just the individual heat wheels. And then for FY '23, most of this work will be kind of occurring next summer. Replacing some of the doors and the frames at the Mitchell School. They're falling apart. They're heavy to open for the little kiddos. So replacing those. And then the Pollard modulars, the siding is starting to wear. So replacing some of that just to get us through until the bigger plan. That high school boiler replacement that I had previously talked about, again, at the Mitchell, the back entrance, is kind of deteriorating, and fixing that up to get it through until the school gets renovated completely. Replacing some of the shades at the Newman, looking at doing that whole, like for the entire school, as they kind of just wear with, usage and stuff over time. It's much easier to get them all done at once than it is to piecemeal, because then by the time you're done, you're redoing them all again. Looking at making, we are looking at the carpet replacement at the library as well, with a large part of that funding being what to do with the books and moving them and stuff like that. So, yeah, but it does equal, it does total up with our current estimates to be $1 million spent over the next year and a half, I'd say.
I have a question for you or Dave. Historically, I forget, do we often draw on the tax levy for this?
Yes, we tend to, some years overlay free cash and tax levy. There's a component that is, it's maintenance as it implies. There's some improvements that come with it, but the improvements are incidental. It's more of a maintenance side. This is the one warrant article that we do it deliberately as a warrant article because it always crosses fiscal years. And that's why it works better this way.
Any other questions?
Alright.
Well,
So-
we should. probably take a
Yeah, I'd
vote.
like to make a motion that we, the finance committee, recommend adoption of Article 5, the public facilities maintenance
Second.
program.
Any discussion?
Yes, so what I'd like, so I think we should vote articles so that, town meeting knows whether or not we're supporting articles, but I think that on this one, if we do not vote in favor of everything in the capital, free cash capital article, that we revisit the funding source for some of the articles that we may be voting in favor of the plan, that we might want to change some of the funding sources.
So in order to do that, I think it would have to be in the form of an amendment.
And that's okay.
Amendments can be offered on town meeting.
And I'm fine with that. I guess we'll have a free cash discussion after. I'll bring it up then. Any further discussion? Okay, so we'll come to the vote. John,
Yes.
Louise,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next article is rescind debts, 32.
Send you that, this is gonna be my article, so I'm
Oh,
not sure. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, there are two authorizations that will be closed out for rescissions. It's the Rosemary Recreation Complex. It's everything associated with the project is done. And there is a $36,000 balance in the bonding authorization to be rescinded. And the second is the Memorial Park Field Building. The same thing, everything is been addressed and the project is closed out. PVPC oversaw both projects and they have voted to release those projects. So, and that has a $34,000 balance remaining, borrowing authorization balance.
If this is passed, do you know how much authorized but unissued debt remains?
Oh, between these two, is that-
Or if this passes, other than these articles. I mean.
other than these articles and after the bond issue that we're doing in a couple of weeks for $10 million, which is the which is the public safety building, again, is another $10 million being borrowed as we're getting close to the end of that project. There'll be about $10.5 million in total open authorization. Most of that's actually in the utilities, water and sewer.
Question, are we seeing any significant slippage in the interest rates?
You mean the increase in the
Yeah.
rates?
Yeah.
Yes, in fact, this is one of the reasons why we're doing a bond issue rather than a note for
To lock it in?
to lock it in. rates have been going up, they're still, historically favorable,
Yeah.
but they are ticking up. And hence will be.
So the
borrowing.
question is is there any more aggressive posture we have to take in that respect or?
Well, remember, I use 7% rates. They're not at 7%.
Yeah.
We're seeing them going from 4 to 4.5, 4 and
Yeah.
4 3/4 right now.
Well, even so, if you could, the more you can lock in at 4.5.
Oh,
the better you
you-
are, we are.
Correct. We're borrowing as much as we
Okay.
can at this point in time, because there's also
That was my
penalties
question.
to borrow too soon.
Any other comments or questions? Is there a motion?
Yes, I'll make a motion that the finance committee recommend adoption of Article 32 to rescind debt authorizations in the amount stated for the Rosemary Complex and the Memorial Park Building.
Second.
Further discussion? I will vote John,
Yes.
Louise,
Yes.
Tom.
Yes.
Rick.
Yep.
Dick,
Yes.
and I vote yes. The next article is the Athletic Facility Improvement Fund 34. I also, because of the way we discussed this last time, it seems helpful to discuss free cash in this context. I asked Dick to take a look at free cash, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, I look at it, the component of free cash is this sheet that you've got, which takes a look at the revenue over expenses for the last 5 fiscal years. And basically, as Dave has said in the past, the revenue varies between 2 and 4% excess over the estimated amounts. And pretty consistently, it's 3 to a little over 4% on the expense turn back. So you put those two together and you get the figures that are on the sheet.
And just for free cash, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, I think as printed in the warrant, it's envisioned 15.8 million of the certified free cash would be appropriated in this town meeting warrant. And in total, I think the total amount of free cash that's been certified is about 16.95 million.
Yes.
So there's about $1 million of free cash that's not anticipated to be spent at this annual town meeting.
As published, if this was voted all as is, yes, it'd be about $800,000 actually that would be unexpended, unappropriated, and which would close out and become free cash in the following year.
Do you yet have an idea of if it would be spent at like an October town meeting, or if there's any?
It won't exist after June 30th. Free
Yeah.
cash has to be recertified every year.
Well, I guess, would it be certified in time for, when would that be certified?
This year's free cash didn't happen until the third, until the 4th week of January.
Oh,
Yeah, but because there's certainly constraints on our part to get it all done, because everything has to be closed out and audited. And then the Department of Revenue has to go through their process, and everything with them takes longer now too. So I would say it's very unlikely that'll be available for an October town meeting.
do you have something, please? One other question. So of that million, I guess, is there, is it prudent to say that you believe for next year rather than spending it this year?
Well, of course, it's the conservative, I think it's always
Right.
prudent to have reserves available. But the other aspect is having the plan in case there was something unexpected, because we still have a special town meeting, that there would be available some to appropriate for those and others for the special town meeting in May. Or for instance, the Emery Grover project, if for a reason that the CPC opted not to fund 6 million, but fund something less than that. My immediate response is that the amount of the project to be funded by general fund debt would go up. However, the community may have a conversation. No, let's apply even more free cash to the project. So that also gives some flexibility there. But certainly the last few years, we have been doing free cash turnbacks, and that's been more in tune because of all the uncertainty with COVID, which is waning now. And this year, even as contemplated, the turnback of free cash to roll over to the next year is on a percentage basis, the lowest percentage in a while.
I just had a couple of questions or maybe comments. This chart right here, did you put that together, Louise?
Yeah.
It's great. It's really helpful and I would, and it was simple, but I was wondering if it would be really helpful, at least to me, if we could go back to the prior years and maybe do a similar categorization so we can see sort of what our trend has been. I would ask over the last 5 years of how we've spent free cash. Amongst the things, I just think this is great to look at it, and it would be just to see how it stacks up against other years. It would be helpful if we could maybe format that in that way. And then at least in my next one, when we were discussing Emery Grover, in the project and what it was going to be in October, I think our expectation was that it was going to be a borrowed project, and that it was not going to be, that free cash wouldn't be allocated to how it was going to be funded. And I mean, the 4.5 sticks out to me just because of the number and where it stands on other things we have. And I guess my question is, what's changed? Why aren't we borrowing it? And one, and then two, is the Emery Grover the correct place to put these funds with all the other either one-time things we have or obligations in the future that we haven't met yet? And would it be make sense to put some of the money towards there? So I don't think we're having that discussion tonight, but those are the things that are going through my mind that I think that this committee needs to have a discussion about.
And Mr. Chair, to the point, Louise, of course, gave you a nice summary so you can see the projects, but actually every year in the capital plan under the revenue, I summarized the categories of how free cash is spent. Like this year on page 2.16, you'll see a 5-year history, how much has been allocated to the budget, how much has been allocated to capital, how much to financial warrant articles, and how much has been put into reserves. So.
Thank you. So I guess in the context, the reason why this came up is because I think last time we discussed the athletic facility improvement fund, if there were any monies available from free cash to supplement or replace the appropriation instead of from the tax levy from free cash, that might be appropriate.
And just to remind, in respect to why you're seeing this particular one that says tax levy is that it's the fees that are being collected by the Park and Recreation. And the amount you see there's a rolling based upon the 5-year average of what they generate in fees. So that's why it says tax levy. It's the receipts that we're anticipating they're collecting that would be going, covering the cost.
I think we were thinking of supplementing the tax levy.
Yeah.
So my thinking would be that we would approve this and then we would think about amending it.
Yeah,
Based on the other in future. I don't think we're in a position tonight to say, let's allocate another 500,000 to it. At least I wouldn't be, but I think when we get to the end, right before town meeting, we have a good sense of the overall picture. We could then say that might be a good place to recommend an amendment to put some additional funds there.
Remind me, what's the target of this fund?
I have to go back and look at the notes. This is one of the funds that has a moving average because it's based upon a combination of the estimated cost for the carpet replacements and other projects that get identified that the town wants to save up for athletic facilities. And I forget what those were, but we're far from it because we're under $1 million. And last time we wanted to be at 2 million. So I think it's a number north of 2 million.
Really, 800,000 now?
It's 900.
Okay, so it's more than the,
But we don't need the 2 million, we don't need to push carpet for another 10 years, say, right?
That's correct. And that's why I need to go back to see what other projects have been contemplated in conversation as money was coming in, comes into this. There's several field projects in the horizon.
Right, so, but if we're just talking about just carpets and don't put any inflation escalator, we're looking at $100,000 a year to hit our target. So we're at 900.
Yes, correct. If it's just the
Yeah.
carpet, correct.
Is there any reason not to sort of try to level fund it over 10 years, once we add all the other elements that we're talking about?
There's no reason not to. It certainly would be great to fund it at a greater level, but the one source of revenue that we know that is coming, that's what we're looking at generating on average. Certainly, if you can put more monies aside, you're not gonna hear anything.
No,
negative from me.
I don't know, I'm just thinking, just, you know. If we-
You are being recorded.
If we find out what we have a projection over the next 10 years and we put in $150,000 a year and just say that's our target every year, then we have a better understanding instead of having the discussion about what we should put in.
Mhm.
We know it's gonna be $30,000 or $50,000 out of the revolving fund. So then the balance would become.
That was the point Barry was making.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, we can discuss later. We're just setting up April to be a very heavy month as we push some things over. So be it, I guess.
Well, you do wonder after, tonight with the CPC, if there's an opportunity to really rethink the whole timing of everything
Mhm.
and having them push up their application process and having applicants know that they need to get it in, let's say, in September, so we can maybe spend some of the fall doing it as opposed to, it's frustrating to have it all backloaded at the end, is there's a lot of parts to it, and it's the way the timing goes that makes it really hard.
As you talk about that, I'm just wondering too, if there'd be any value in when those applications come. We see them, we can look at them from a financial perspective, maybe give them some questions to ask. So all that gets done, because now they're gonna go back and they're gonna scramble in a very short time and vote next week. I'm just wondering if it doesn't break any rule, could we not do this together?
Well, I just want to express, sorry. I think the process, the CPC is independent, and I think they have their own process. They can set that. I think the best thing is we could just ask to have an earlier consultation. I think that might be the simplest solution.
It just may be more difficult.
Only if they've got the
If they don't move up their application process. it might be difficult. I don't know if they have a regulation. that requires it.
So,
I'm not suggesting, I'm not suggesting we eliminate their independence. I'm just suggesting we become more of a resource to them.
I think if they are able to move it up as John suggests, then the conversation we had now could happen in January.
Correct. That was what I was
So
getting
then
at.
we have a follow-up in March.
Right, that's what I was
Something
getting
like
at.
that, if
Rather than the
necessary.
week before they're voting.
Yeah.
busy in January. Okay, so I guess we'll push the athletic improvement fund to late April.
Well, I don't know.
We could vote it,
I-
talking about
I-
voted, we could just
Subject to
amend it.
amendment.
Yeah. The same
You
way
don't
we
want to do
did.
that, Josh. That doesn't sound like, right?
No, I mean, it's fine, we can do that, but it's. If we anticipate having to take another vote anyway at a later date, why don't we just?
I
take
don't
one?
know that we do. It depends what happens. Right?
Well, talking about logically, we said that
Yeah.
$100,000 is, we want to start level funding it. If we voted to approve it at $100,000 today, we'd find that, right? We'd find that 70,000. And so we could just fix that at the end
Yeah, we can do it now.
if we wanted to. I just,
Okay, is there a motion?
yeah.
No,
I'll
there's no motion.
I'll move that. I move that the finance committee recommend adoption of article, and I apologize, you have it on the agenda. 34, correct. For the appropriation to the athletic facility improvement fund.
In the amount of $33,533.
Yeah.
For discussion. We'll vote, John,
Yes.
please.
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Rick, Dick,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes. Last is issues not reasonably anticipated. Go ahead.
So the only one I have is on the tip. So we received documents. I found them less than convincing. But the board of selectmen voted to sign the tip. And they were requested, as I understand it, by more than one town meeting member to place it on the special town meeting warrant for ratification. They refused to do that. So I think that issue is done.
Yeah, I spoke as a town meeting member, not as a member of the finance committee. I was one of those people requesting that they approve it, but make it subject to town meeting ratification.
So I actually, and I'm happy, even if this goes into the record, I actually think town council's opinion is incorrect legally. So, and I thought it was very problematic.
Well, when you look at it and say it was to sign all documents pertaining to the TIF, those were the implementation of the TIF.
Correct.
It was not, it did not speak to
2012.
a modification of it. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
Is there a role for the finance committee now?
No, I think we did our,
Done.
we made our viewpoint.
So the next meetings are next week, March
Mhm.
30th, and then April 6th. So far after that, we only have April 20th on the calendar, but I don't know, it's very busy. We'll see what
I will
happens.
not be able to attend next week.
Okay.
One of my articles is on there. It's the refuse thing. I'll be able to catch up with it pretty short. But I just wanted to let you know that I do know that.
Anything else? Is there a motion to-
I'll move to adjourn.
Okay,
Second.
we'll vote John,
Yes.
Louise,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Dick,
Yes.
the chair votes yes. Thank you. Good night.